If I want to influence someone for good, without violence or threat, my primary tool is verbal influence. Now, I can serve as a silent witness, a model for someone, and that often does work, but only slowly over time. So, most of the time, I must use words in written or spoken form. Suppose you'd been asked by a friend what you think about the question of getting a COVID booster. Your friend has read different opinions and wants to discuss them. You could use a variety of verbal strategies. Expostulations. What are you waiting for? Get boosted now! What? Get a booster shot? Fool! Or commands. Go to your pharmacy right now and get your booster. Or, do not under any circumstances put another jab in your arm. Judgments. What? Are you a COVIDiot? Do the right thing. Or, only an idiot would put another dose of spike protein into their bodies. Advice. I did my research and got the booster. You should too. Or, I did my research and learned you just can't trust Big Pharma. Bad questions. If you don't get boosted and get COVID and make your household sick, then will you feel happy? Or, if you get the jab and 3 days later keel over from a heart attack, may I have your PlayStation? Statements. Since the pandemic ended, you've enjoyed close fellowships with more friends lately. Or, it is difficult to know where to get reliable information about either COVID or the vaccinations. Stories. When I was in college, I wanted to be brave, so when my friends asked me if I wanted to try pot, I said yes. I did try it, but I never really felt comfortable doing it, and I soon realized that trying pot didn't make me brave. Actually, I had two competing fears: the fear of losing control or losing my focus on one side, which made me want not to do drugs, and on the other side, it was the fear of being rejected by my friends. Smoking pot was not being brave, it was just letting my fear of being rejected get the upper hand over my fear of doing drugs. I think the booster issue is kind of like doing drugs. Reasonable people with reasonable fears land on both sides. Good questions. What fears do you feel are most relevant for you and shaping your thinking on this decision? What is your top concern as you think about getting the booster? What risks do you give the most credit to on each side of the issue? And finally, affirmations and thanks. I love that you are willing to talk about these things without judgment. Some friends have been difficult to talk to because they have such strong feelings in the absence of clarity. Now, as you read down this list, the speaker of these words claims less authority in the life of the person they speak to. At the top of the list, the speaker considers himself or herself to be expert on the topic and implicitly an expert on the life and reasonable choices of the listener. As you move toward the bottom of the list, the speaker may still be eager for influence, but treats the listener like they are the expert on their own life. Influence strategies focused on the expertise of the influencer often focus on spelling out approved or correct behavior. This has the advantage of being transparent. The actions desired may be quickly understood. This is sometimes appropriate when dealing with urgent situations that can be explained more fully later. I used commands, not stories, when biking with my young children to keep them safely at the side of the road and out of traffic. Yet these tools, most obviously advice and commands, often leave friends without deep understanding of why. In general, influence strategies in which the influencer is seen as the expert, the top half of the list, leave a friend open to feeling manipulated through bad questions, controlled through advice or commands, or even judged through judgments. Influence strategies involving open communication, such as affirmation, good questions, stories, statements, focused on priorities and goals, require more time and listening effort. Still, they can be rewarding as a friend comes to their own clarity about what choice would best fulfill priorities and objectives. The friend is much less likely to feel manipulated or resentful, but rather grateful for the skill and attention of the listener. All of my prior videos in this series on influence have worked toward this goal. These videos are taken from material in my small book, Wise and Gentle Words, Sketches of Leadership for Humble Influencers. So let's look at Jesus influencing someone who has not come to him asking for guidance. How does he influence this Pharisee? What strategies do you notice? I'll be reading from Luke 7, verses 36 through 50. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and took his place at table. And a woman in the city, who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating at the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began to bathe his feet with her tears and to dry them with her hair. Then she continued kissing his feet and anointing them with her ointment. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw it, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what kind of woman this is who is touching him, that she is a sinner." Jesus spoke up and said to him, "Simon, I have something to say to you." "Teacher," he replied, "speak." A certain creditor had two debtors. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debts for both of them. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, "Well, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the greater debt." And Jesus said to him, "You've judged rightly." Then, turning towards the woman, he said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which were many, have been forgiven. Hence, she has shown great love. But the one to whom little is forgiven loves little." Then he said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." But those who were at the table with him began to say amongst themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Now, just looking back over this, what choices does Jesus make in his effort to influence Simon? Well, firstly, Jesus goes to Simon's, the Pharisee's house. The story happens early in Luke, but it's clear already that Jesus and the Pharisees don't see eye to eye. The Pharisees are still strangely attracted to Jesus, skeptical as Simon was, but not cynical, at least not yet. Jesus did not turn down the invitation to influence his Pharisee counterpart. Secondly, Jesus brings up a topic as if he's knocking on Simon's door. Simon opens the door to Jesus. "Teacher, speak," he says. Thirdly, Jesus tells a short story, a parable with a very simple message. Fourthly, Jesus asks a question about the story, and Simon answers appropriately. He gets the point of the parable. Fifthly, Jesus then asks a safe but more personal question. Do you see this woman? Obviously, it's a kind of rhetorical question. The woman is there, but chances are Simon has not really seen the woman. Probably he's trying to avoid looking at her directly because she's not appropriately dressed, perhaps. But Jesus focuses Simon's gaze at the woman. Then Jesus goes on to make three factual statements about the woman and her extravagant love and honor compared to Simon's relatively inhospitable treatment of Jesus. This would have been hard for Simon to be compared unfavorably to this woman, a sinner. So Simon has probably never in his life been unfavorably compared to a woman of the night. Continuing, Jesus does imply from this story that both she and Simon were sinners. Though she was a much bigger sinner, Simon would have had to understand this point. It wasn't an insult, but a backhanded compliment. Even Pharisees knew that they weren't perfect and that they were theological sinners, but while not being societally condemned, quote unquote, sinners. From our modern perspective, it might even be considered that Jesus was being quite generous to Simon. His hypocrisy had to be at least as sinful as the woman's outright sinful lifestyle and more repulsive to modern sensibilities. From today's perspective, by implying that Simon was the minor sinner, though of an equally unpayable debt, he's actually being quite affirming to Simon and generous. Next, Jesus then summarizes both the parable and the point about the woman in an uncontestable comparison. She has shown great love because she has been forgiven much. This also makes the tacit implication that if Simon is not feeling particularly generous toward Jesus, perhaps it's because he's not been given or at least received any forgiveness. Simon, of course, would not directly ask Jesus for forgiveness, yet this reproach goes unstated, and Simon would need to have ears to hear Jesus, or he simply would miss this implicit and gentle reproach altogether. Finally, Jesus then directly addresses the woman, affirming her faith and blessing her with peace. But in this whole story, what Jesus did not do is give Simon advice, ask bad and manipulative questions that would make Simon defensive, judge him for his hypocrisy or hard-heartedness, or command him to repent and be humble. As I've said before in this series of videos, advice is often overused because some people feel they have a responsibility as friends to tell others what to do. Bad questions or judgments make clear the desired direction of the influence of the speaker. When even well-meaning people use these verbal tools, their goal in these conversations is to dispense their own wisdom, hoping that it will positively affect the one to whom their advice is directed. Of course, others avoid doling out advice or overtly attempting to influence their friends. They believe sincere friendship means pure acceptance of their friends, regardless of their choices and decisions. Both of these strategies have merits, but both are deficient. People need wisdom, sometimes supplied by their leaders or even their friends. But people also need acceptance, love, and support, especially from family and friends. If we care about people, we can aim for more than either a dispassionate dispensation of wisdom or an open and uncritical embrace of them. My goal in the influence and support of others is not that they hear from me about what they should do, but rather that they should hear from God, as we have said before. This distinction is not mere piety, nor is it a refusal to seek influence. I want to engage people in ways that will help them gain deep and godly conviction regarding their priorities and values, and I want to help them more faithfully live by these priorities and values. My goal is simply not to get people to do what I want them to do. Because getting people to do what I want them to do is not my goal, I don't pursue strategies aligned with that goal. Instead, because I want them to hear from God, I employ verbal choices aimed at helping them do this. As we have seen, good questions can cause people to think. They provoke insight. They imply that solutions are not obvious. As people ponder questions, they often gain understanding. Statements, made often as observations, require a bit more trust. A good open-ended question does not require the responder to agree with the speaker. Indeed, a good question doesn't make a point but invites the answer to the question. However, a statement does make a point. Often the statement points out the invisible obvious. The speaker makes an observation that people think, yeah, actually, now that you mention it, that's really true. Jesus did this in the story in Luke 7. He reminds the Pharisee of the vast difference in how he was treated by his host and by the quote-unquote sinner who had no standing in that hall and yet was overcome with love and affection for Jesus. Simon could not argue with Jesus' statements. They were facts and evidence. Nor could he argue with the conclusion those facts implied. So now I'd like to talk about two real-life stories from small groups with which I'm familiar. The small group members were stunned. They had just heard Ron say, I've decided to go out and buy a Porsche 911 Targa. Ron had earlier spoken of his recent layoff from work. His fellow small group members were prepared to encourage and pray for him at that point. Now they didn't know what to say. He had a fine automobile, probably a $30,000 vehicle in good working order. But his self-diagnosis was that his personal crisis wasn't anything that the purchase of a $125,000 automobile wouldn't solve. So the small group members were shocked and silent. The evening ended with Ron's words hanging over the group. Ron didn't get prayed for, nor did people talk to him about their concerns. Ron and Julie were committed members of the small group and of the church. If the group members had spoken up, they might have asked, Ron, how are you feeling about the loss of your job? Help us understand the connection between your job loss and the desire to purchase a Porsche. Have you and Julie discussed what is next for you as a couple and a family? How does the purchase of a new car fit in right now? But none of these questions were asked, nor any of a dozen more. And of course, beyond the questions, perhaps someone might have stated the unstated obvious. Ron, it seems that addressing the underlying work employment issue would be your most pressing issue right now, for your family's sake. Now, perhaps this was all for the best. Asking questions like this can get personal very fast. Ron might have felt hurt, having his choices and priorities subtly or perhaps explicitly challenged. Others in the group, who drove expensive cars, though no one drove a Porsche, might have felt the heat of unwanted scrutiny. So they all left, unwilling to speak to Ron about it. In each of the cars driving home that night, but one, the group members were talking about Ron's nutty idea that an outlandish car purchase can medicate his professional disappointment and uncertainty. However, they never mentioned it to Ron. This group did learn one lesson that night. They learned that, despite the theory of there being a small group for one another, they couldn't really rely on one another to speak the truth, or even to ask about the truth, or perhaps even to care. They learned that they could expect gossip, not truth spoken in love. They could expect niceness, but not wisdom. This incident taught, and more likely reinforced, the unwritten communication rules of the small group at great cost to the group and everyone in it. Now here's another scene. Diane, always a flamboyant storyteller, had just confessed her defeat. He ended a one-day fast 3 hours early by eating 3 Eskimo pies. Her plea to our small group, pray for me, I feel so weak and guilty. The small group members each responded by giving Diane what they thought she needed. Encouragement. At least you skipped lunch. And understanding. I find it's impossible for me to fast. And relief. Don't feel guilty. Unfortunately, no one engaged her or asked a question. Finally, someone thought to ask, Diane, what was your intention in fasting? Diane had hoped to spend the day in prayer for some friends facing a deep struggle. Instead, she was so distracted by her hunger that she couldn't pray very well. Another question. What did you believe about God at 8 a.m. that you forgot or didn't really believe by 3 p.m.? As her fast day began, Diane firmly believed that God was available to her through prayer and that she viewed her fast as a privilege to focus her day and her heart on prayer for her friends. But by 3 p.m., all she could think was that if she were to eat a single morsel of food, she would have failed God and his requirements of her. Hence, when she ate one Eskimo pie, eating two more hardly seemed to matter. After she spoke, one group member summarized, "It seems that your fast day changed from something you were asking God to do into something you were doing for God. I can relate to you. I take a gift from God, turn it around, present it to him on a platter, or I feel guilty when I cannot." Diane, God didn't ask you to do something heroic for him. Everybody could relate to Diane at this point, and a broader discussion ensued. Gently speaking the truth in love and not fearing the truth is the biblical picture of how a small group or a family is supposed to relate. In the context of secure love between them, brothers and sisters are asked to help one another by mutually debunking sin's lies in an attitude of humility and compassion. Consider one final case study outlined below. When you know people with issues you can see because of your proximity to them, you can often see how they affect you and others. You want the best for these friends, but know that well-wishing alone will not help them. They're not coming to you for help, so you must initiate with them. Like a good sentinel, you want to sound a word of warning in the most hearable way possible and with the best likelihood of a positive result. You need to speak to and listen to them with humility and gentleness. Of course, conversations that begin with questions may go in very different directions, and no simple case study can serve as a rigid template for these kinds of discussions. But let us examine one more case study illustrating how we might be a better influence in the lives of others through a willingness to help them spot the lies they have chosen to believe. In this, we're talking to our ministry partner. Anne always seems nervous about your ministry's upcoming outreach events, to which many people contribute by playing music, hosting, taking care of logistics, and inviting their friends. It seems her demeanor is affecting the faith and expectations of the rest of the team, so you decide to talk with her. What would you like to ask Anne? Anne, how do you feel about the events? How have they gone for you? What do you feel good about? What do you feel not so good about? What might be possible heart issues to address? Anxiety, fear, lack of trust in God, inability to trust others with their role in the program, and feelings of carrying the whole thing on her shoulders. Anne seems to fear that God won't show up. Perhaps she thinks, my worry is the only thing holding this outreach together. These thoughts are deceptions. Anxiety robs Anne of the enjoyment and satisfaction of the events as Jesus is taken out of the picture. It also affects the team's faith and vision. Can you tell a story to show her your compassion for her? And I was always a very responsible student in college. I kept up with all my readings and assignments and was typically over-prepared for tests and finals. But I was anxious every time before a test and felt certain to fail, until I realized that my anxiety was fear, that I wasn't good enough, that I wouldn't measure up, even that God wasn't in my academic calling. I realized I needed to repent of my anxiety and trust that my preparations would be sufficient for God's purposes for me. How could you discuss these issues with Anne in a way that enables her to be receptive? Anne, I normally think of you as a fairly joyful person, so I was excited to work with you on these events. But I've been noticing that you seem very tense. It seems that anxiety has been robbing you of your enjoying the outreach. I'd love to see you enjoy it for your own sake and because I think it would be contagious for the rest of the team if you have fun. But as it stands, it's more your anxiety that the team is catching from you. So what could we do to help you receive more freedom from Jesus for your sake and the team's? What are your hopes for Anne and the team? If Anne has a valid critique of the outreach events, I certainly want to hear it and hear her express it productively, not as worry. I want her to grow in faith. I also want the team to respond well to her, not just write her off because of her needless worry. I hope that you enjoy a small group experience where the conversations we've been talking about in this short series of videos can be had between group members, during the group itself, or around the edges in the relationships built there. I've participated in and led many such groups over the years and have enjoyed years of accumulated trust and affection, challenge and affirmation, exhortation and appreciation that comes from putting these lessons into practice. I hope these short videos will help you take whatever is your next step in this process of growth and discipleship in the company of friends. Finally, I just have a few questions for reflection. Number one, perhaps your mind goes blank as you even consider how relevant this material is. You may not know any people well enough to exhort them daily or even monthly. Or it may be that you know people well enough, but you haven't thought about them, intending to bless them in this way. Not judging them is not enough. Speak with kindness in ways that will help them spot the destructive lives they've been believing. What would be a good first step? Secondly, perhaps you're on the other side of the spectrum and have ready advice for everyone who will listen. How can you build the habit of using more open ended, other affirming verbal strategies like asking questions, telling stories, or making the invisible, obvious statements that build trust yet bring about hearable influence? Thank you for watching this video. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you think of somebody that you think could benefit from watching this video also, please send them the link. It helps me get the word out and it'll help your friend as well. Thanks very much.